Alright class, now that you've read the first chapter of Matilda in groups, I'd like for you to focus your attention on the whiteboard as you begin to make an illustration of the characters, settings, and main events. Let's first discuss characters. So characters are basically who or what the plot is about. Now class, can you name one character in the book so far? Yes, I think the main character would be a girl named Matilda. Now what can you tell me about Matilda? Yeah, she's about 4 years old, and she's really small. Let's think of another character. There's also Mr. Wormwood. He's Matilda's dad. We don't know much about him, but we know he likes to watch TV. Can we think of another one? Mrs. Wormwood. We know that she likes to play bingo, and leaves Matilda home a lot. Another character would be Matilda's brother, Michael. We know that Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood like him a lot more than they like Matilda. Another character in the first chapter of the novel is Mrs. Phillips. She is a librarian, and she helps out Matilda by giving her books. That's why we're going to represent her with a pair of glasses and a little book to the side. Now there are two types of characters in the story. Main characters, which would be Matilda, Mr. Wormwood, and Mrs. Wormwood. And they're main characters in the fact they have a large role in the plot of the story. Michael and Mrs. Phillips are minor characters because they play a small role. We will now be discussing setting. Setting is also known as the places where the action takes place. In the first chapter of Matilda, I think the setting is the Wormwood's house and the library. The Wormwood's house is where Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood, Matilda, and Michael all live. The library is where Matilda goes to get the books, as well as where she meets Mrs. Phelps. We will next be discussing sequence of events. Sequence of events is also known as the main events that take place. The first main event that occurs is when Matilda asks her dad if she could have another book. Now we know that Matilda taught herself how to read at age 3, and at age 4 she wanted to read more, but her dad said, no, you need to watch TV. The next event that takes place is when Matilda decides to go to the library by herself when her parents leave her alone. So she walks to the library where she meets Mrs. Phelps and where she reads books in the children's literature section. She gets very happy. The next event is when Matilda has read all of the books in the children's literature section. That is when she talks to Mrs. Phelps, and Mrs. Phelps gives her even more literature, but this time she gives her adult classical novels as well as a library card so she can bring them home. The next event that takes place is when Matilda goes home and she reads the books that Mrs. Phelps gave her. And she reads and reads and reads all day while her whole family is gone. Now, but we'll be using these illustrations and cartoons as a reference for the next part of our lesson. Thank you so much for being engaged in this activity.